The once stable economic partnership between the US and Canada was upended overnight when President Trump announced sweeping 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods, citing border security and drug concerns. The announcement, made in a televised address, stunned both nations and sent immediate ripples through global markets. For decades, the US and Canada had enjoyed one of the world's most robust trading relationships, built on trust and mutual benefit. Now, that foundation was suddenly in jeopardy. The November 2024 announcement sent shockwaves through Canada, signaling a new era of confrontation. Politicians scrambled to respond, while ordinary Canadians watched in disbelief as their economic future was thrown into uncertainty. By March 2025, the US imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, accusing Canada of unfair dumping and threatening decades-old supply chains. The move hit Canadian manufacturers hard, putting thousands of jobs at risk and raising costs for American businesses that relied on Canadian materials. In April, Trump escalated further, slapping permanent 25% tariffs on all Canadian vehicles and auto parts, devastating for an industry built on cross-border integration. Automakers on both sides of the border warned of plant closures, layoffs, and higher prices for consumers. The administration's rationale was twofold: force production back to the US and, shockingly, pressure Canada toward statehood. The message was clear: America first, no matter the cost to its closest neighbor. The climax came in May, when Trump doubled tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum to 50%, vowing to protect American workers. The move was cheered by some US industries, but economists warned of severe long-term consequences for both countries. For Canada, this was an economic earthquake, threatening access to its largest export market. Businesses faced plummeting orders, and entire communities dependent on trade braced for an uncertain future. The rapid escalation from initial threats to unprecedented tariffs marked a fundamental rupture in North America's economic landscape. Supply chains that had taken decades to build were suddenly at risk of unraveling. The era of predictable, cooperative trade was over. Trust between the two nations was shattered, and the future of their economic partnership was more uncertain than ever. US industries braced for retaliation, while Canadian leaders scrambled to respond. Emergency meetings were held, and talk of counter-tariffs filled the air. The world watched as two of the closest allies entered a trade war with no clear end in sight. Global markets reacted nervously, and other nations wondered if they might be next. The stakes were enormous. Jobs, industries, and the very fabric of the Canada-US relationship hung in the balance. Families on both sides of the border faced an uncertain future. The tariff bombshell had detonated, and the fallout was just beginning. The world could only watch as the consequences of this historic rupture continued to unfold. When Trump's administration unleashed a wave of aggressive tariffs, it sent shockwaves through Canada's political and economic landscape, threatening decades of carefully built cross-border cooperation. Canada's government, initially caught off guard, quickly shifted from cautious diplomacy to bold, decisive action, determined to protect the nation's interests. Early appeals for reason and compromise soon gave way to a historic turning point. New Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before the nation and declared that the era of close economic integration with the US was over. Carney unveiled a bold new strategy. Canada would dramatically reduce its reliance on the US market and aggressively pursue new trade partnerships in Europe and Asia, opening doors to fresh opportunities. Industry groups, who once favored quiet negotiation behind closed doors, now demanded strong retaliation and robust protection for Canadian workers and businesses, fueling a sense of urgency. The government responded by forging new trade agreements at a record pace, aiming to insulate the Canadian economy from the unpredictability and volatility of US policy decisions. Across the country, the national mood shifted. What began as anxious hope transformed into a powerful, determined resolve to chart a new course for Canada's future. Canada was no longer willing to simply absorb economic blows. Instead, it would stand firm and defend its interests, even if doing so came at a significant cost. The relationship with the US had fundamentally changed, perhaps forever, ushering in a new era of uncertainty and independence. A new chapter in Canadian economic policy had begun, one defined by resilience, innovation, and a renewed sense of national purpose. The tariffs triggered immediate economic shockwaves in both countries. The Canadian dollar plunged, and recession fears mounted as exports to the US collapsed. Steel towns like Hamilton faced plant closures and mass layoffs. Auto tariffs threatened tens of thousands of jobs, In the US, the pain was felt too. Auto stocks tumbled, and major manufacturers warned of supply chain chaos. The interconnected economies meant that hurting one hurt both. American border states braced for job losses and economic decline. Consumers faced rising prices on everything from cars to canned goods. The tariffs, meant to protect, instead spread uncertainty and hardship. The cost of severing North America's supply chains was becoming painfully clear. Both nations realized there would be no easy winners in this trade war. The trade war's drama played out not just in policy, but in the powerful words of leaders and industry voices on both sides of the border. As tensions mounted, every statement became a headline, every press conference a battleground for public opinion. President Trump, defiant and unapologetic, promised a revival of American industry, declaring, "Our steel and aluminum industries are coming back like never before." He framed the tariffs as a necessary step to protect American jobs and restore national pride, rallying his supporters with bold promises of economic resurgence. In contrast, Prime Minister Carney announced, "The old relationship with the United States is over," signaling a new era of independence for Canada. His words marked a dramatic shift as Canada prepared to chart its own course in the face of American pressure. Industry leaders like Catherine Cobden warned, "This move essentially closes the U.S. market to half of Canada's steel production," urging immediate government action. She spoke for thousands of workers whose livelihoods now hung in the balance, calling for unity and swift intervention. The shift from Trudeau's early optimism to Carney's grim realism underscored how quickly trust had eroded between the two nations. Hopes for compromise faded, replaced by a sense of urgency and growing anxiety. Canadian businesses demanded protection. American workers faced uncertainty. Across both countries, families and communities braced for the fallout, unsure of what the future would bring. The partnership that once defined North America was now a battleground, with old alliances fracturing and new lines being drawn. The rhetoric was fierce, but the economic consequences were fiercer. Markets trembled, factories shuttered, and uncertainty rippled through every sector. Both sides dug in, preparing for a long and painful conflict. Negotiators worked behind closed doors while protesters took to the streets demanding answers and action. The voices of leaders and workers alike echoed the stakes: survival, sovereignty, and the uncertain future of two nations now locked in a struggle that would shape their destinies for years to come. The trade war's impact was deeply personal for ordinary people. In Canadian towns like Windsor and Hamilton, families faced job loss and economic anxiety as factories struggled. Small businesses saw costs soar and markets vanish overnight. For American workers in border states, cross-border jobs and trade dried up, threatening livelihoods. Farmers lost access to Canadian buyers. Truckers faced delays and uncertainty. The easy friendship of the border was replaced by suspicion and hardship. Everyday life, from groceries to weekend trips, became more expensive and complicated. The human cost of the trade war was measured in lost jobs, strained communities, and frayed cross-border ties. As the dust settled, both nations faced a future clouded by fear and faint hope. Canadians worried about lasting economic decline and the loss of entire industries. The political rift threatened decades of trust and cooperation. Yet some saw hope in crisis, a chance for Canada to diversify, become more resilient, and forge new global partnerships. On both sides, business leaders and citizens pushed for reconciliation, hoping economic pain would force a return to cooperation. The ties of trade and family ran deep, offering a foundation for eventual healing. The path forward was uncertain, but the desire for stability and prosperity endured. The question: could old friends find common ground again? The Canada-US relationship now stands at a crossroads, its future unwritten. One path: continued escalation, with both sides locked in economic trench warfare and rising costs. Another: gradual de-escalation, as mutual pain forces leaders to negotiate a new, more managed trade agreement. Or, a third path: Canada forges a new economic identity, less reliant on the US, seeking global partners and greater self-reliance. The choices made now will shape North America for generations. The deep ties of history and commerce have been tested but not broken. The challenge to rebuild trust and cooperation in a changed world. Will the two nations find a new partnership or drift further apart? The answer remains unwritten, shaped by the decisions of today.